Sherry says, did you get my question about confession? Can you still take confession if you have been divorced and remarried outside the church, but you are both Catholic? Good question. Sorry, I didn't see that earlier. My feed is jumping all over the place, so I probably just missed it. Sorry about that. To answer your question, Sherry, so the situation, it's not a strict yes or no simply because you've been married outside of the church. If you are trying to get married inside of the church, there can be a little window to be able to go to confession, and I'll explain that right now. So what happens with some people is, they were married in the church, they divorced, got an annulment, perhaps kind of fell away from the church a little bit, met someone else, fell in love, got married civilly, and now are growing in their faith and kind of coming back to the church, but they have this kind of irregular marriage situation, is how we refer to it, where they're both Catholic, or one of the two is Catholic, but they're not married in the church because they couldn't, and there's this previous annulment, and there can be all sorts of circumstances where a person just decides, we're going to get married civilly because we don't have time to wait for this annulment to go through. And so for two people who are civilly married, who are doing their best to resolve their marriage situation, what they can do is that they can make the decision to live as brother and sister, is the saying. And so it's specifically in reference to romance, right? So it's live as brother and sister. That if the couple is willing to say, you know what, we didn't do this right in the past, but we want to fix this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to commit ourselves to, living as brother and sister is a great way to do it, or a great way to think about it. Like, if you wouldn't do it with your brother, you wouldn't do it with him. If you wouldn't do it with your sister, you wouldn't do it with her. Because canonically, if there is a previous marriage, well, that person is still married to the previous person. Remember, for Catholics, we can only get married once, and that marriage is until death do us part. And so until the annulment process can go through, and just to remind everybody also, the annulment process it's not Catholic divorce. What the annulment process does is it's an examination, a legal process analyzing the marriage, that first marriage that took place. And essentially it either analyzes whether the person had what it took to get married. So for example, sometimes people don't have sufficient maturity, or perhaps they didn't have a complete understanding of what it was that marriage meant. Or maybe they did have what it takes, but they didn't mean what they say. And so, they may have been in the marriage and they may have said until death do us part, but really in their minds, they thought, no, if things don't go well, I'm out of here. Or perhaps they promised to be faithful, but really they had no intention to be faithful in marriage. Or, there can be a whole variety of different things. And so what the church does is it trains canon lawyers, and they go in and they, like lawyers, they investigate and they make arguments, and they say, hey, look, here's all this evidence. It seems that perhaps the person didn't have what it takes to get married at that time, or they didn't mean what they said at that time. And therefore, because they didn't have what it takes, or they didn't mean what it said, it wasn't really a sacramental marriage. And so because it wasn't a sacramental marriage, that means that it wasn't a marriage. It was in civil law, but not for the church, and not in the eyes of God. And if that first marriage was not a marriage, was not a sacramental marriage, well, then both of those parties from that first marriage are free to get married. And so that's what the annulment is. It's essentially saying, oh, that first one that looked like a marriage, it actually wasn't a sacramental marriage. Therefore, you can get married in the second the second civil marriage that you're entering into. And so while a person is going through that process of all of the investigation, even though they're civilly married, if they're willing to make that agreement that, hey, until we find out what the real situation is with this annulment, we're just going to live as brother and sister. then at that time, yes, they can go to confession. And they even can receive the Eucharist at that time. But they have to make that commitment and genuinely do their best to live as brother and sister. Yeah. And so if the annulment does come through, then those people get married as quickly as they can. And if the annulment does not come through, then there either needs to be a permanent decision of, nope, you know what, we're just going to continue to live as brother and sister, or perhaps even separation. You know, if there's no kind of extenuating circumstances for why they would need to stay together. So for example, sometimes if the couple already has kids, it's actually better for them to just stay in the same house and take care of the kids. But yeah, at that time, if you wanted to continue to receive the sacraments, you would need to make that permanent decision. If you have not received or if the response to the annulment was, you know, negative, that was actually a marriage, then yeah, you have to either not receive the sacraments or make that permanent commitment. I think that was all of the questions. Sorry. Yeah, and just one additional thing. You know, a lot of people, when they hear this idea of like, wait, you're going to ask somebody to live as brother and sister, that means to not have sex? I don't know if they can do that. You have to remember that the people who are asking or who are saying that are actually, they're priests, right? We're celibate, and we chose that freely. And so you know, it's not like there's some weird suppressed thing happening within me. I chose freely to forego the marital act for the sake of the salvation of souls. And so when we ask these couples to make that commitment to live as brother and sister, we're not asking them to do anything that we ourselves haven't done, to make this commitment not to have the marital act, at least for a period of time, for the salvation of their own souls. So that's what's really being asked, and I think that's a very reasonable thing to ask. If you've got any more questions, please let me know, because I'm happy to answer anything about that, Sherry.